Sue. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted you're all here, particularly because when Sue and I first talked about what we were going to talk about this evening, Sue said, I don't think there are going to be more than 5 people there. And I said, oh no, I bet you there will be. So
he won the bet.
It's good to be proved right. I also have to confess that we have known each other for a very long time. Beth sort of ran through, when she was writing through the magazines that I've written for, one of them was Double Take, and Sue was my editor at Double Take, and was the person who commissioned the stories that I am most proud of ever having written. And so I owe her big.
That's how I got him here. It's the payoff. They were wonderful stories, the kind of stories that you can't read anymore. I mean, you could go back to the library and read them, but they're not being written anymore. They were just terrific pieces, and it was really fun to work on.
Yeah. So we are, just before I got here, came in here, I met Sue outside, and she announced that she doesn't want to read from the book. So if you are hoping to hear her read from the book, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. But we are going to be talking about it. It's a complicated, interesting, multi-layered novel, fundamentally about 2 women who have interesting parallels in their lives and differences. And so I'm going to ask you to describe it just a little bit.
Sure.
Without going into detail.
Yeah. We want to keep the mystery going here. And I'm sorry I don't want to read, but honestly, like when I go to reading, sometimes I'd much rather hear the writers talking rather than, I figure you can read the book. You don't need me to read it to you, so we'll see how that goes. But so it's a story of these 2 women, as Rob says. One is 17 years old, a high school senior, who is adopted, and suddenly and literally out of the blue, her mother is killed. And so she has to deal with this question of who is she now? And she never wanted to know her biological family. She still doesn't want to know her biological family. But she's not completely sure what she got out of this relationship, how it worked for her. And so we see her sort of going through the process of both grief and kind of understanding her identity. Part of that includes deciding not to go to college and instead to go work on an organic farm in Vermont, which in her community is blasphemy. Everyone goes to college. She lives on a street called Cornell Drive. All of the streets are Ivies. So that tells you something about the community in which she's living and the expectations for those kids. And the other person whose story is being told in a parallel track is a woman who looks like she's got her life totally in order. She's successful, she's kind of married to her job, she owns her own home, and yet she's never asked this question, which is, am I happy? Do I deserve to be happy? What does happiness even mean? And we learn from her that what looks like success may not actually be success. It may be success in a kind of corporate way, but it might not be success in an existential way. And these 2 stories run in this parallel track, and you're probably thinking when you're reading it, like, how is this going to resolve? How is this going to happen? It does happen, but in a kind of interesting and non-linear way. The woman who has not asked the happiness question hopefully finds happiness, and the young woman who decides not to go to college finds out she really likes being a farmer in Vermont. But that's not really her story. Her story is really trying to find out who she is.
So, the first question when you're reading a novel like this that always comes to mind is, how did these people and this story arc, which is very definitely there, come about? Like,
So it's sort of funny. I had this day job, and the day job was writing about politics and technology for the New Yorker, and it was also during COVID. A lot of it was during Trump's first administration, and then Biden. But it was so depressing after a while. I was writing about sort of the death of democracy. The overtaking of our lives by AI, and it was just so much. And I really needed something to kind of amuse myself and also give myself a break. And for a while, part of that was watching. I got kind of hooked on watching these and reading about these twin studies. These studies about how these identical twins are raised in the same family, or are raised in different families, but they end up marrying women of the same name and having the same job, and all these things that you would think are impossible, but you see it in twin study after twin study after twin study. And then from there I started looking at these. There are like all these videos, and as I said, I was like trying to distract myself from the horribleness of the current moment. And that there are all these videos about adopted people looking for or finding their biological family. And so those two things are sort of in my head. And then I just started thinking about, what would that be like? And I also had these two friends who were both adopted, who had no interest in finding their birth family, zero, which I found so weird. Like, I thought if I were adopted, all I would want to do was figure this out. It'd be like, what a puzzle. But they just had no interest. And so I thought that was an interesting place to be as an adopted person, especially since I was watching all of these adopted people, like looking for their families and finding them or not finding them, mostly finding them. So it just all kind of started percolating. And then with my other character, I think do you remember, like, for a while, I think it was in the 80s or early 90s, like when women, it was sort of prior to that horrible book Lean In, but it was when like women were like wearing power suits, and they like were trying to be men in the workplace, and how kind of depressing that was. So I was just thinking about a person who sort of bought into that and thought, well, that's who I'm supposed to be. That's how I'm supposed to live my life. And it didn't necessarily occur to her that that wasn't really a life.
Yeah, I should say that though the book centered around these two women, they're not the only characters in it. It's actually richly peopled, in particular with friends, and in particular, each one has a very close friend. And the dialogue, the dialogues between the two pairs are just like fantastic. They're really fun to read. And but in a sense, I don't know if they're parallel friendships, but the degree to which each of the main characters leans on their friends and vice versa.
Yeah.
It really struck me.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't really thought of it, that there were these sort of parallel friendships. Everyone hopefully has friends, so I wanted to write about the friends of these people, but they were very crucial. In the young woman whose name is Melody, her best friend, whose name is Lily, she met her at adoption camp when they were really little kids. And Lily is very, very different. All she wants to do is find her birth parents in China, which is probably going to be impossible. And, she looks at an iPhone and wonders if her biological siblings were the ones who put it together. She was adopted by these very high-powered doctors in Westchester who have very high expectations for her. And it turns out, she is very, very smart, very brilliant, actually. And probably will become a geneticist, in part because of this situation that she finds herself in. But she's a foil in a lot of ways to Melody, because she's, she goes to Stanford, she's very high achieving, and her friend is going to go off and dig in the dirt. And then on the other hand, Candace, who's the older woman, her best friend was her trainer, and they've just
In a gym.
in a gym, yeah. And they just kind of became friends and kind of almost became family. And he's got his own really interesting story. I don't know if I should say more about his story.
It might come out.
Okay, it might come out. It's possible.
There's a you alluded to this with the iPhone thing. There's a lot of sort of very, I guess, sly social commentary
Yes.
in the book. It's not hitting you over the head at all, but it's slipped in there, and it forms part of this world that they inhabit. And as a writer, I'm curious how that happens, because we're going to get into fiction and nonfiction in a minute, but.
I think I am pretty sarcastic, a little, or cynical,
Really?
or yeah, a little bit. And so, and also, I mean, it's really hard to look at society and not have opinions about it. And I was able to express some of those opinions through my characters. I said that Melody grew up on Cornell Drive, and in Westchester, in a place where the property values are determined by whether or not everyone goes to an Ivy League college, which I find, disturbing. But I don't say that. It just sort of comes out in the course of the book.
So here's my writer's question.
Yeah.
I've been a journalist or nonfiction writer my entire career. People ask me every once in a while if I have a novel in me, and the answer is always no, I don't. I can't imagine the ability to come up with something like that. So I went back and took a look at some of your opus over the course of your career. We got novels about a small town New Hampshire library, a kid's novel about an aspiring writer and pastry chef, a novel about a hardscrabble small town, one other as well. Nonfiction books about a therapy dog in a nursing home, memory research, the monarch butterfly migration, migrations to solitude, articles on politics and technology, which has been your bread and butter, and there are a lot of them. Traveling by air with a bicycle, Oklahoma City becoming a Vietnamese food hotspot. So, like, does your mind ever stop? And
I don't think so, but the world is really interesting, right? I mean, there's so much going on, and there's so much to look at, and so much to think about. One of the great things about being a writer is being able to explore all these things. I mean, I always say it's like being in college. I mean, probably also because there are a lot of deadlines. Thank goodness. But it's like being in college all your life. You find a subject and you get to write about it, and hopefully no one grades you on it. But then you get to move on and do something else. It might actually be a reflection of a certain kind of ADD. I don't want to admit that, but it's very possible that that's what it is. But it's just, the world is really interesting. When I was doing the butterfly book, it was because, we were in Mexico doing something else, and we went to this butterfly reserve, and there were, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of butterflies, and I thought, how did they get here? How did they get here? And that was an interesting question, which a lot of people were studying. And then I got really interested in the people who were doing that. Like, there was this subculture of somewhat slightly crazy people who had dedicated their lives to following this monarch migration, and I thought, that's an interesting story. That's the story that wasn't being told. The story of the migration was being told, but these people, no. So, and things just sort of evolve, right? And I mean, that, like, all the stories you did for me they're sort of a piece, but they were very, very, very different.
yeah. Yeah, that's true. But you reach a point. So let's go back. You fall into the adoption and twin studies rabbit hole, and you could easily have taken that in a nonfiction direction, but instead, you did this.
Yeah.
So what was that process like?
Well, part of it, as I said, I was so overwhelmed with what was going on in our political life, and I was writing about it, and it was pretty depressing. And I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read. I feel like at this moment in time, it's really, really important for us to take a breath. And for me, taking a breath is reading a novel. We're not going to be able to do the things that we need to do to challenge the powers that be if we're overwhelmed and tired and depressed. And so for me, the antidote to some of that was thinking about a story and then writing a story and having characters in my head who are talking to me instead of having that voice that we all know and that we hate. I assume we're all in that situation. And so it was just, one of the weird, interesting things about being a fiction writer is you start developing characters and then they take on a life of their own and they start talking to you, which is weird, but it's true. And so that started to happen way before I started writing. And then I probably wrote, a chapter maybe and let it sit, and then it sort of started to take a life of its own. But again, it was a way of stepping back from the world that I was immersed in, and sometimes I think stories are better told not in nonfiction, because sometimes in nonfiction you're hitting someone over the head with it, or it's information driven, and sometimes it's much easier to reach people who might not agree with you on a lot of things by telling a story that they can find some relation to. And a lot of times when you're writing nonfiction, it's perceived as being partisan, even if you think it's not. Even if, like, when I'm writing about elections, I think elections are something we all should care about, no matter if we're Democrats or independents or Republicans or libertarians or whatever. I think we all should care about it. But often when you're writing something about elections, it's perceived to be, liberal or left-wing or something. And so you've already alienated all these other people who are never going to read it because they've made their decision about who you are, as opposed to a story which is hopefully, agnostic politically, and it gives people this opportunity to relate to people who may not be like them. And I think we understand that fiction is a way of generating empathy. And so, for me, it was in a funny way, it was doing that for me as I was writing it, and also trying to understand these people who are very different than I am. So that's also a kind of a fun thing to do, is try to put yourself in a position of someone who's just really different than you are, and try to be fair to them and true to them, and tell their story.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, as you were just talking, I realized that it was sort of thanks to the characters in the book and to the story in the stories in the book that I really found myself sort of thinking in a way I don't think I would have faced with a nonfiction piece about adoption and nature versus nurture, and even, okay, I'm going to blow like one little plot point, I'm sorry, but there's a sort of secondary but still major character who emerges because he gets rescued from drowning in a frozen pond when his daughter's dog, when he's trying to rescue his daughter's dog, and that in turn set me thinking a lot about like these moments in life that turn on a dime. It's like everybody's lives would have been different had that event not happened, had they not been together and then taken a walk and then.
Yeah, it's true. And yeah, so much, I mean, it is a tiny little plot point, but so much of what happens after that is a consequence of that moment. Last night I was doing an event in Saratoga Springs, and the Rob of last night was a wonderful guy named Joe Donahue, who's you probably don't get WAMC, that's a public radio station in Albany. And I think it was he who asked me how much of this book is autobiographical. Or maybe someone asked me that question, maybe he didn't. And I said, basically none of it, except for this one thing, which is years and years and years ago, this friend of ours had left her golden retriever with us when we were living in the Adirondacks. And we have a pond in the Adirondacks. And the dog was a wonderful dog, but not too bright. And the dog went on the ice and fell through. And my husband, Bill, the dog was on the other side of the pond. The pond is about an acre. And it was in the middle of winter, or not quite the middle of winter because the pond wasn't fully frozen, although the dog fell in kind of where the water comes in. And I watched Bill run and run and run and run, because we're watching the dog, and the dog is like breaking more and more and more ice, and it's really cold. And then Bill is like taking all of his clothes off, and he jumps in the water, and he saves the dog. The dog's name is Hank. And he comes out of the water, and there's snow on the ground, right? Now he has no clothes and no shoes, no nothing. And he has to run all the way back in the house, and he's beet red when he comes back in, and they like throw him in the shower. And the dog is like, whoa, this was cool. This was really fun. Well, maybe I'll do it again. And so I have to say, the only autobiographical part in the book is when when the dog falls into the pond. Yeah.
If I'd had to choose one, that would not have been the one I picked. So that's pretty wild. So, as you can probably tell, we could keep this going all night, but you may have some questions too. So why don't we turn the floor over to you?
And don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Please
don't be shy. Alden, I know you're not shy. Oh, you're not shy. That's excellent.
I have not read the book, so I don't know the answer to this, but whatever point of view you chose to tell the story, how did you choose it?
Did everybody hear that?
I'll repeat it. So the question was, how did I choose the point of view that I told the story from? And that's a really interesting question, and it's a funny one because I'm not sure I can answer it. I knew I was going to write it in the third person, so that was clear. In part, I was going to write it in the third person because I find writing in third person kind of hard, and it was sort of a challenge that I was setting myself. So that sort of is part of it, in my last book, in the Roberts Library book, part of it's in the third person and part of it's in the first person. Not me being the first person, but one of the characters writing in the first person. And so I think once I decided it was going to be in the third person, I knew I was going to tell their story as opposed to them telling their story, if that makes sense. So, yeah. But a lot of times when you're doing this, it's somewhat mysterious how it happens. I mean, I really do feel like the stories tell you how they want to be told. Mm-hmm. It doesn't always work that way, and sometimes you have to start all over again, but ultimately they tell you how they want to be told, I think. It sounds a little woohoo, wooey, but what can I do? Yes, there's a question back there. Oh, it's Karen. Hi, Karen.
So you touched on this already, but I'm curious if you can say anything more about your relationship with the characters. Like you talked about that they talk to you.
Yeah.
And I'm curious sort of, I don't know, the nature of the conversation or what it is you're getting from them or
Yeah.
not getting or, you know.
I think part of it is, it's not, sometimes it's like literally dialogue. Like, oh, this is what they're saying. This is the conversation that they're having with each other. I better remember it. You know, so luckily I keep a pad by my bed, and I might write it down, or I might wake up in the middle of the night and start typing, not like very coherently, but sort of something that I've kind of imagined. And so that's part of it. Part of it is, I think, once you set things in motion, I was writing all this other stuff, but I think our brains are so complicated that the story was percolating even if I wasn't actively thinking about it. And then some of the time, some of that kind of rose up, you know, to a more level of consciousness that I could tap into. But it is a very, very mysterious process. And it makes it sound easy. It's not easy. It's really, really hard. And my daughter is here, and I'm going to tell a story that's going to embarrass her, I think.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you. But it's a funny story, which is that when she was 7, and I think I was working on the Butterfly book, she looked at me one day and she said, "You know, Mom, what J.K. Rowling does is so much harder than what you do." And so I thought that was an incredibly astute comment. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, what you do, you already have the material." You know, because I had stacks of books and all these research papers and all my reporting and, you know, lots of pieces of paper surrounding me as I was going about trying to figure out how to tell this story about these people following the migration. And then she said, "But what J.K. Rowling does is she doesn't have anything. She makes everything up." And I thought that's a really interesting way of trying to understand the difference between nonfiction and fiction, even if when you're writing nonfiction, especially in books, or the kind of pieces that we do, you have a story arc, you have characters, you know, you build a story. But she was right. And so when I say, like, I'm hearing these voices, I don't mean to say that it's really easy. I just mean to say that when you set something in motion, our brains are so interesting and complicated that, you know, they can work on multiple tracks at the same time.
You know, it makes me wonder, there's you and me, there are several writers and illustrators and cartoonists in this room. All of us confront what used to be called the blank page. Now it's often a screen. At the beginning, it's like there's nothing there, and then there has to be something. Yeah. Is the process of creating that something, is your approach to creating that something different when you're writing a nonfiction book as opposed to a novel?
Yeah, I think in a funny way, writing a nonfiction book in which you have all this material and you have to be allegiant to it, and you know you have to tell the truth, right? And in some ways that's harder. Sorry, Sophie. But in some ways it's harder because you don't have as much latitude. You have certain latitude to structure your piece or your book, but you don't have a lot of latitude. You can't make it up. You know, you can't say that, you know, green is blue and blue is red or whatever, which you can do when you're writing fiction. And so there's a certain level of liberty that you can take when you're making stuff up that you can't take when you're writing nonfiction. And so in that sense, writing nonfiction can be very, very challenging, in part because you have all this material, and what do you do with it? you know?
Yeah.
How do you shape it? What do you throw away? What's important? And you have to make these choices, and what happens at the other end really depends on them, as opposed to writing fiction. I was thinking about this the other day. And it was some book, I think it was my first novel. I had a scene, I thought it was hysterical, and I thought it was great, you know, whatever. And, you know, it was all made up and very made up. And my agent at the time read that, and she said, you know, this is really good, but get rid of this thing over here you wrote that you made up, you know. And I was like, but I really like it. And she was like, yeah, and it's really not good. I got rid of it. Yeah.
Way back there.
Do you always know what's coming next, or do you keep a
Lisa,
pile
it's
of
hard to hear up
ideas?
here. There's a fan going.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wondering if you keep sort of a running list of what's coming next. Do you know, like, what the next project is? Do you keep a pile of ideas? How
Yeah,
do you move
I do.
through?
It doesn't necessarily mean that I'll ever go back and look at that list, but I like to have that list because, you know, maybe I will or maybe I won't. I'm not sure, but yeah, I do, because ideas don't necessarily, they're kind of hard to come by. So yeah, I guess the answer to that, Lisa, is yes. Dan.
Does what you're writing affect what you're reading?
Yes. So Dan asked if what I'm writing affects what I'm reading. Yes, absolutely. So I actually, one of the downsides of spending a lot of time writing fiction is I don't want to read fiction at the time because I don't want those voices in my head. And it can be really frustrating because I like to read fiction. And also because my friends are always asking me, what are you reading? What should I be reading? And I'm always asking them the same question. And then so I have to make a list when I'm not reading of what they're reading. And then I'm really useless because I'm not reading. But yeah, absolutely, which is different than when I'm writing nonfiction. When I'm not writing nonfiction, I like to read really good nonfiction to get a sense of how someone else has told a story that may be hard to tell. Like, you know, you're a mathematician, you know, telling a story about math or a mathematician is a hard job because you need to talk to people who know nothing about your subject. And that's true for me too. I write a lot about things I actually know nothing about, and so I have to learn. Like, I spent 5 years at Columbia University learning about neuroscience so I could write a book about memory. But the goal is always to figure out how to write something that other people can read. I always keep, you know, like my mother in my mind is like, if I write this book, can she understand it? And when I'm writing a nonfiction book. And so I like to read other people who've cracked that nut. Yeah, Alden.
A question about your way of editing your own work. How much raw prose do you need to write
Yeah.
to get to a chapter? And has your style of editing your own work changed through
Yeah.
the years?
Yeah, so Alden asked about how I edit my own work. It's a really interesting question. And the other part of it is, has it changed? And I would say, so almost until I think very recently, I write by hand. I write in a notebook, a spiral notebook, and I don't care what I write. I just figure I'll be able to go back and fix it. I just, like, my mind is working pretty fast. I feel like I can actually write this tactile, the tactile nature of writing physically, I think is really helpful. But I just write, and I do this for nonfiction as well, or for all my New Yorker pieces, or any other piece. I just write, and it's a way for me to look at what I'm thinking, and it's usually a total big mess. But then when I go to look at it and type, I'm much clearer on what I want to do. So that's part of the editing. The other part of editing is reading it out loud. I think when you read out loud, you can hear how it's working or not working. You can sometimes get, seduced by your own voice, which is dangerous, but I do like reading out loud just to hear it and see if it works. Actually, I wrote a piece last week and I wrote it by hand. But I have tried to write more on the computer, but I find that I don't really like it because it looks so sort of formal and finished, and I don't want to feel like it's formal and finished. I want to feel like I have a lot of room to keep improvising and going back over and over it, and writing by hand lets you do that, and sort of the image I have in my head about that writing in the notebook is I think of a sculptor like throwing a lot of clay and then going back and very carefully using the knife or the hands or whatever it is to shape it, and getting rid of a lot of the stuff. If it's a big lump of clay, you're going to get rid of a lot of it, and that's kind of what my notebooks look like, big lumps of clay. Yes, back there. Is that Harry? Oh, there you go. Sort of.
But I was going to say, do you ever, when you read your work out loud, which I think is essential if you're writing, do you ever do different voices for fun?
No.
Do you like doing that?
I don't.
Just try that.
It's an interesting.
Cool idea.
That is a cool idea. I think I don't think I'm talented enough to do that. Yeah, I don't think so. I think I'm also, because I started doing that when I was writing nonfiction, to hear how the words flowed, and so I just sort of kept doing that with fiction. Have I listened to AI reading my stuff? No, I think I might slip my wrist if I did that. I'm actually, the only AI that I've used is to have it talk in my dog's voice, actually. And I do that quite regularly, sorry. I mean, who wouldn't want to know what their dog sounded like, right?
That's great.
I do think, I'll answer your question in a second. I've decided that the best use of AI would be to interpret my grandson's babbling. Wouldn't that be cool? Who actually know what he's saying instead of pizza, pizza, pizza. Yes.
I'm curious if there's anything you read, I'm guessing nonfiction-wise, that was particularly useful in helping you form your story?
Not in this book. Definitely in nonfiction. But also, like, I used to read fiction and then actually go through it and try to deconstruct it to understand how it was made. Because I didn't necessarily really understand the mechanics of it or even the structure of it. Or I would take a book I really liked and say, how did this person do this thing that I really liked? And I think that was really helpful. It wasn't that I was like looking at it and saying, what's the model I'm going to use for my story? It was just like, I like what this person is doing. How did they do it? And I think if you're interested in writing, anything really, but fiction in particular, it's really helpful to do that. It's a good exercise because you learn a lot about someone else's structure, not necessarily their process, but their structure. And I'm also like really interested in different structures. I can't say that one of my books does have a really kind of interesting structure. It's called The Book of Hard Things. It was my first novel. And every chapter is a kind of, is a different rock. And I remember I had been reading Primo Levi at the time, the periodic table, in which each chapter was another element, and I thought that was a really interesting way of telling a story. And so I didn't exactly copy it, but I got this idea from that. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your relationship to the New Yorker and the pieces that you've done in the New Yorker, and how that is very different on writing a book?
Yeah. Well, I was writing, and I've only in the last year written like 3 pieces, but at the time, when I was on the staff, I was writing probably every 10 days I was writing a piece. And it was a little bit more like writing for a newspaper, except it was an article, and doing a lot of research really fast to try to understand what was going on. And that's a really different. And then I wrote some very long pieces as well that required 6 months of research. I just got an email from someone who had read one of these pieces, and this is a piece about that's actually quite relevant at the moment. It was about the attempt to use artificial intelligence to run fighter jets to allow pilots not to be the ones doing the dogfighting, but to be doing other things, like running other parts of the battle. It was called battle management. I spent 6 or 7 months with these pilots and these AI people, and they put me in the flight simulator, and which was super fun. Happily, I crashed many times, and it didn't matter. But something like that, where there were so many moving parts in that piece, and with all those people, there were probably 70 people that I had to talk to, maybe more. And I had to really understand. I had to understand the AI. I had to understand the avionics. There were all these things I had to understand that were really hard to understand in order to write the piece. But that's what nonfiction, long-form nonfiction writing is, unless you're writing the same piece over and over and over again, which hopefully we don't do. There's a person back there. Yeah, hi.
Hi. I have been listening to you talk about the work of nonfiction and the work of fiction. And I've heard what I'm hearing you say, there's an element of joy in both. But in the fiction, it's accessible differently than in the nonfiction. Can you talk about the joy in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that writing fiction is joyful, and that's why I did it, because writing the nonfiction was kind of overwhelming and felt very important, which may be a little self-important, but writing about the threats to democracy, as someone who feels very strongly about the importance of democracy, did not feel joyful in any way. It just sort of felt necessary. Writing, I wrote, the dog walks into a nursing home, which is sort of I would like to say, a kind of veiled moral philosophy, book of moral philosophy, told through the story of my dog and my relationship and our work for 7 years in our local nursing home. And that was joyful. It was joyful, shockingly, to do that work in the nursing home, which shocked me because I thought it would be hard, and it wasn't. And writing the butterfly book was also wonderful. Partly because the butterflies are so beautiful, and partly because the people I was writing about were so intensely in love with the butterflies that it was really hard not to sort of, glom onto their intensity and their happiness, and then of course their concern and worry that the habitat for the butterflies was going to be overrun and would disappear, and with it the butterflies. But I would say the reason why I wrote this book is because I wanted more joy in my life. And as I said before, I recommend reading fiction if you're feeling overwhelmed about what's going on out there. And it just will give you a kind of a better recharge to the engine that you're going to need to be thinking about the hard things.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Bill.
So Jane and I each have a lot of nieces and nephews who are adopted, and I help raise my sister's kids. And so I was really a part of their lives. They lead very complicated lives, and I wonder what the significance is in this book. And I'm just always trying to figure out why their lives are so complicated. And it's from literally sanitariums to Cornell. That's where they've ended up.
Yeah.
But brown.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't think I'm a expert on adoption. As I say, I was struck by my two friends who had no interest. They felt their lives were really great, or at least good enough, and they didn't want to inject their lives with more complications. They thought things were going pretty well, and so there was that. In my book, I've got these two young women who have diametrically opposed desires for connection. I don't know why that is. I mean, we're all different. And so, but in both of these cases, and I don't know if that's true for your family, but in both these cases, they're growing up in these, affluent communities where the assumption is that they're going to succeed. It's just built into the DNA, and we know these communities. This probably is one of those communities, and so probably. What do I know? And so one of these kids has sort of imbibed that, and it's probably part of who she is, and who knows whether it's part of her DNA or whether it's just that she was raised by these two high-powered doctors. And Melody isn't that person and is very confused as to whether or not, she knows she doesn't care. She says she doesn't care, but maybe she does, and you're gonna have to find that out, because there is a kind of, have to say, no spoiler alerts.
I wasn't going to go.
I'm not going there.
closer.
I'm just gonna say that there's an interesting twist and reveal in the book. Yeah, woo, exactly.
That seems like a really good place to stop.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
My pleasure. So you're going to sell them?
Yeah, they're books.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyhow, you're dismissed.
Thank you for coming.